Our second reading is taken from Leviticus 25, starting in verse 13 to 31. In the year of Jubilee, everyone is to return to his own property. If you sell land to one of your countrymen or buy any from him, do not take advantage of each other. You are to buy from your countryman on the basis of the number of years since the Jubilee, and he is to sell to you on the basis of the number of years left for harvesting crops. When the years are many, you are to increase the price, and when the years are few, you are to decrease the price, because what he is really selling you is the number of crops. Do not take advantage of each other, but fear your God. I am the Lord your God. Follow my decrees and be careful to obey my laws, and you will live safely in the land. Then the land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and live there in safety. You may ask, what will we eat in the 7th year if we do not plant or harvest our crops? I will send you such a blessing in the 6th year that the land will yield enough for 3 years. While you plant during the 8th year, you will eat from the old crop and will continue to eat from it until the harvest of the 9th year comes in. The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants. Throughout the country that you hold as a possession, you must provide for the redemption of the land. If one of your countrymen becomes poor and sells some of his property, his nearest relative is to come and redeem what his countryman has sold. If, however, a man has no one to redeem it for him, but he himself prospers and acquires sufficient means to redeem it, he is to determine the value for the years since he sold it and refund the balance to the man to whom he sold it. He can then go back to his own property. But if he does not acquire the means to repay him, what he sold will remain in the possession of the buyer until the year of the Jubilee. It will be returned in the Jubilee, and he can then go back to his property. If a man sells a house in a walled city, he retains the right of redemption a full year after its sale. During that time he may redeem it. If it is not redeemed before a full year has passed, the house in the walled city shall belong permanently to the buyer and his descendants. It is not to be returned in the Jubilee, but houses in villages without walls around them are to be considered as open country. They can be redeemed, and they are to be returned in the Jubilee. The Word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Boy, if that doesn't have sufficient written all over it, huh? This week's word, sufficient, we're going to take a look at that. When we think of the word sufficient, we first think that God is to provide just enough for us. That sufficient is just enough so that we can get by on. We're going to wait. Good morning.
Thanks me a while. Everything I did this morning hurts.
Oh.
Sit here. Sure. Hands hurting so.
You got here just in time for the good part.
Oh, I'm not sure about that, but But when we think of sufficient, we think of just enough to get by on. And then when we look around the world, we think, well, there's a lot of people, a lot of places that don't seem to have a sufficiency of things. And sometimes we think of sufficient as a return of investment. That if we put in so much work, that we should get a sufficient amount out of that work. That we should gain something out of that. That it should become sufficient for us. This idea of the year of the Jubilee actually is God's way of showing that He will provide what is sufficient. In the middle of all this Jubilee talk, in verse 18, God kind of throws in this little side note. Follow my decrees and be careful to obey my laws, and you will live safely in the land. We're talking about Jubilee, and we're talking about how property is going to change hands and everything. And in the middle of it, God says, follow my laws and live safely. This is the whole key of everything else that God tells us. To obey His laws, and everything else will be sufficient for us. If we look at how He sets up the real estate, it becomes really amazing. If you really get into the economics of it, and the behavior of it, and what it would mean for a community to act this way, it really becomes interesting. I want to go towards the end. Let's talk about the walled city first. The walled city is where your king would live, and your princesses and your royalty. On the outside of the nation, you would have the walled cities. The walled cities would be where your armies are, so that it would be a safe place that if you were being attacked from somewhere, you would go to the walled cities. So in this sense, you can kind of understand that if you have a captain of the army that has a house there, every 7 years you don't want to have him pack up and go back out on the farm where he began. And if you think about it, our government is somewhat set up the same way. We have people that we send home every so often, and then they return. But we have some that just stay there from administration to administration, because these people are in charge of markets or whatever they might be in charge of. We don't necessarily want them turning over and having to go back and start anew with a new government. It would weaken the infrastructure. So in God's way, He said, you know, you get somebody that's good in there, in the market and whatever, and that's prospering and leading the country economically, then let them keep their house. Let them stay inside that wall city. The treasurer and all these people, you want them inside and protected. And that's what God is setting up here. Is that as people grow and God points those to lead inside the city, inside the government, so to speak, He builds a wall around them and says that these are those people. So that's sufficient for the economic growth and the economic and the government for the people of the nation that God is setting up. Now, outside is where your farmers would be, and your country folks and your livestock owners that would be supporting the city on the inside. And here what we find is that if you sell something, it's kind of a backward situation. Because what do you usually do? You usually sell a piece of property, and if you sold it to somebody for, let's say, $10,000, and they improved it and it was worth $20,000, then if you wanted your property back, you'd have to go and pay $20,000. But with God, it's just the opposite. If you went and your land is worth $10,000 now, and they use it, then it's worth less to them. So in order to redeem your property, you might need $2,000 after 4 years. And the idea is, if you think about it, if I give you $10,000 now, and you have 7 years to go, let's say maybe you had a $3,000 debt for some reason, and you paid the $3,000 off, and you were very frugal with the rest of your money. Well, in 3 years, you would have a place to go back to, because if you save that money, you can redeem your property. So it gives you hope for the future. It lets you know what to plan on in the future. And we see that theme with God right through the resurrection. The theme is that you have hope to where you're headed to. See, God's system didn't take away anybody's hope. And it also didn't allow you to stand up and say, oh, look at me, I've got all this property. Because in 7 years, guess what? You don't have all that property anymore. You have your own property. Why? Because God has said that is what's sufficient for you. See, God's idea of sufficient isn't just the bottom line. It's living with His laws and His commands, and that the future is sufficient. The future is there. Obviously, we don't follow the Jubilee anymore. I don't know of anybody that gives people property back after 7 years of buying it. But the interesting thing about the Jubilee too is that people would sell their property and then work their own property and eventually get it back and never have to move. And the reason being, it was a way of community helping community without one overtaking advantage of the other one. There was probably many instances where somebody that was, and we'll just call it that, not real bright, had a piece of property but couldn't manage it themselves. So every 7 years they got their property back. Every 7 years they sold it back to the same person that treated them well for another 7 years. And their family lived that way. And it was more than sufficient for them. See, God's way makes it sufficient for everybody. And it's when we get out of that way, out of God's way, that we start seeing the gaps of those that don't have enough. And then also the problem becomes insufficient, is that we start setting our standards. What is sufficient? What is truly sufficient? If we know what sufficient is, then we know where to start to say, here's where I'm blessed. Here's where the abundance begins. If we set our sufficient level too high, then what are we? We're one of those people that always goes around complaining that it's not right, it's not fair, things aren't happening my way. They go out and they start working even harder to make what they feel is what is sufficient. We see ads all the time for your retirement account. Is it sufficient? Is it sufficient? Do you have enough to go on vacations till you're blue in the face and travel around the world and never even come back to your piece of property? So the question that God is proposing here with the year of the Jubilee is always come back to what I've given you, and that is sufficient. If you really get into the economics of it, This is actually the time of growth for the Israels. When they follow these rules and these laws as they're fresh and new, and don't try to tweak them a little bit for themselves, this is the time that they explode in the new land, because these are the rules that God has given them to live by. So it's not that they go in and they say, well, you know what, I want to get ahead and work. That's not their objective when they go into the new land. They're going in understanding that what they build, they're going to reap. They're going to get to keep their own house. So if they build their house up now, and even if they have to sell it tomorrow, they're going to get the house back. And their neighbor. And their neighbor. It behooves them to be kind to their neighbors, because you never know who's going to be buying your house next time around. It might be the old grouch down the road. Or it might be you buying theirs. And then, because you might buy it in the 5th year, you might only have it for 2 years. And then turn right around and have to sell yours to them. So it's a very unique situation, but it very well defines what God is trying to signify as sufficient. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, after some problems at the church, some people are causing problems, and the question in early was, how do we punish people? How does the early church punish people? The problem being that they came out of the Jewish sector, where there were crimes and there were bad business that had to be dealt with. A lot of the old laws followed through, but in the same sense, the old year of Jubilee was long gone. It was long gone. And those that bought property kept property, and those that sold it for a profit. Those that lent money lent it with interest, and it was a booming economy, much as what the United States is fashioned after. But along with all these laws and rules and everything, the church had to decide, how are we going to decide what's right and what's wrong, and how to punish people and how not to punish them, and what do we punish them for and what don't we punish them for. Paul is writing to them basically to tell them, you have a government that has set the laws. Obey those rules, and they will punish those that need to be punished. Now, on the inside of the church, what Paul is calling for is the fact that these people are sitting next to you, and if they are true believers, then they don't need to be punished. And that the fact that they are out of control, morally wrong, having problems out in the world, what Paul is saying is that is sufficient as their punishment. That is sufficient for what they're doing. That when they come into the fold, into the church, if they are not just coming in there to get away from things, but are honest believers. And you have to remember that back in the early church, it wasn't just as easy to get in the back door. as it is just to walk in and say, oh, I heard you're having church here today, so I came. I mean, you had to be invited. So you had to be invited to that early church. You had to be invited to my house, which was where the church was, in order to be part of this church. So it wasn't just anybody that was out, acting immorally that you'd just bring into the church. The church was kept pretty much separate. And that's what they looked at, is that the church was holy and separate. So what Paul is referring to now is that you have somebody that is kind of back and forth, and you want to be good too, and they seem to cause problems every now and then, that realize that while they're out there in the world, they're the ones that probably just lost their job because they got angry at work and wouldn't shoe the mule or whatever, but they probably lost their job. They're having problems out in the world, and Paul's saying, because they're having problems out there in the world, don't turn your back on them inside the church. But on the same hand, don't overflood them with love that they feel that this is something that they can do all the time. It's God's way of saying it's sufficient that the world is going to punish bad behavior. We don't have to too. We don't have to punish bad behavior. We as a church don't have to make a law that says your bad behavior is so bad that you can't earn my love. That I can't show you any kind of love or forgiveness because you've behaved bad. God says we'll take care of that out in the world. They're going to get enough of that. What I want you to do is be holy and separate people. And that's sufficient. That's what Paul is referring to as, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. What Paul is saying is, I don't have the power to change the world. I can't do that. I can't change everything about me. And even though I pray and I pray for me not to do that. Take this away from me, God. Don't let me be that kind of a person where I get angry and upset and jealous and mean. And God says, you just are. Sometimes you just are. And that's what Paul was really trying to say, is God, make me perfect. And God was saying, no, you just can't be perfect. But you can know that your weakness is just as like everybody else's weakness. And therefore, treat everybody else with the same kindness that you need to be treated with. Because my grace is sufficient for you. In other words, my forgiveness for you being mean and angry and upset and doing things that you didn't want to do, even though you didn't want to do them in the first place, is sufficient. As long as you keep your eye on the cross. Keep your eye on the cross. Hold hands with your neighbors. And know that God is sufficient for you. Amen.